There was a time when Americans believed being watched was temporary, an emergency measure, a response to fear, a short chapter that would close when the danger passed. But history didn't close that chapter. It expanded it, quietly, legally, permanently. After September 11, 2001, America did not only lose its towers, America lost its sense of safety. That morning began like any other. People boarded trains, drank coffee, thought about work, about very small things. Then the sky changed, smoke, sound, and the silence that followed so heavy no one knew what to say. For days afterward, television stayed on. The same faces repeated, the same questions with no answers. Americans no longer asked what would happen next. They only asked whether it would happen to them. Just weeks later, the U.S. Patriot Act was passed. Not after long debates in conference rooms, not after public referendums in open squares, but while fear had not yet settled. The new law opened doors that had once been locked, doors people believed needed to stay locked to protect private life. Monitoring phone calls, surveilling emails, collecting data without traditional court warrants. The language sounded technical, distant from everyday life. But behind those words were individual conversations, personal messages, tiny traces of ordinary people. The public accepted it, not because they didn't love freedom, but because, in that moment, freedom felt abstract and fear was real. When images of collapse still haunted the mind, when empty chairs at family tables had not yet been filled, when the question, "What if it happens again?" had no answer, everything labeled security sounded reasonable. In the years that followed, nothing stopped. Fear no longer stood in the open like a cloud of smoke. It retreated inward, becoming a justification. And from that justification, new things were built quietly, steadily, without pause. Cameras appeared first at airports. No one was surprised. Airports were places where people already accepted inspections, waiting, being watched. Then came the train stations. Stations that once held only loudspeakers and footsteps, now gained eyes mounted on ceilings, unblinking, untiring, unforgetting. Then schools. At first, only at the gates. To protect children, to stop bad actors. It sounded so reasonable that everyone nodded. But then the cameras moved deeper, into hallways, into courtyards, into stairwells. Children grew up with the feeling that being protected also meant being observed. Then street corners, an intersection, a parking lot, a convenience store, a residential block. Cities stayed bright, crowded, noisy. But above them, a silent network was being woven into an invisible net. No one objected. Not because everyone agreed, but because no one saw a reason to object. No one stood up and said, "We are losing freedom," because no one ever said it that way. They didn't call it surveillance. They called it softer words, cleaner words, more reasonable words. Public safety, national security, preventive measures. The words sounded like disinfectant, not pleasant, not comforting, but necessary. And when something is called necessary long enough, it stops being a choice. It becomes a condition. People grew accustomed to walking beneath cameras without looking up, accustomed to scanning cards, accustomed to providing information, accustomed to accepting that the system needed to know who they were. No one ordered them to get used to it. No one forced acceptance. Life was simply designed in a way where compliance made breathing easier. You wouldn't be stopped. You wouldn't be questioned further. You wouldn't be stared at for too long. And in a tired society, ease always defeats principle. Eventually, the cameras stopped being devices. They became habits, then standards. They were no longer mentioned in conversation, no longer debated. They existed like streetlights, road signs, painted lines. You didn't wake up each morning thinking, "Today I will be watched." You just woke up and lived. And observation ran alongside that life like a quiet current inside the walls. Something frightening happened, not because someone wanted to control everything, But because the system learned how to feel normal, surveillance no longer needed to persuade, no longer needed to explain, it only needed to exist. And America entered an era where surveillance was no longer the exception, but the infrastructure. In 2013, a name emerged: Edward Snowden. Not a politician, not an activist, not someone seeking the spotlight, just a man inside the system. Someone who had seen how the machine worked from within and decided to say the one thing the machine never wanted to hear. He revealed that the NSA had been collecting data on millions of Americans, not suspects, not names on a watch list, but ordinary people going to work, making calls, sending messages, searching, falling in love, phone calls, text messages, internet activity, small things, everyday things, fragments of ordinary life. No traditional court warrants, no specific reasons, no wrongdoing required. You only had to exist. America was stunned. Newspapers exploded with bold headlines. Television filled with long debates. Cafes, dinner tables, living rooms, everywhere echoed the same question: how much do they know about us? There was anger, there was doubt, and there was a late arriving fear. People talked about privacy, about the Constitution, about the boundary between security and freedom. Some called Snowden a traitor. Some called him a whistleblower. Others stayed silent, unsure where they stood. For a brief moment, America looked straight into the mirror, and the mirror reflected an uncomfortable truth. Surveillance was no longer a theory. It had been reality for a long time. But then, life went on. Other news appeared. Other crises took over. The timeline kept scrolling, not waiting for anyone to fully understand. Smartphones stayed in pockets. Emails kept being sent. Social media still opened every morning. People said, "I have nothing to hide. If it makes us safer, then fine." The outrage softened. The hard questions became fewer. The long debates grew exhausting. Not because the truth was wrong, but because the truth was inconvenient. Inconvenient to live with every day. Inconvenient to face while life still had to continue. Inconvenient when the cost of resistance felt vague and distant. And so the shock receded, not disappearing, just covered over by habit. America had seen what it needed to see, had heard what it needed to hear, but the shock did not last. There was no great uprising, no crowded public squares, no thunderous slogans, no historic moment to name. Life went on. Mornings still began with alarm clocks. People still went to work, still picked up their children, still stood in line for coffee. Smartphones stayed in pockets, light as harmless objects. Cameras remained on ceilings, silent as part of the architecture. Data continued to be collected. No noise, no warnings, no threats. Everything happened too smoothly to be called a takeover. Americans did not stand up and say, "I accept being watched." The sentence sounded too heavy, too direct, too difficult to admit. Instead, they said something else, lighter, more familiar, easier to live with. "I have nothing to hide." The phrase surfaced in casual conversations, at dinner tables, in online comments, in debates that never reached an ending. It carried no malice, no surrender, only exhaustion. Exhausted from caring, exhausted from doubting, exhausted from staying constantly alert to things that cannot be seen, cannot be touched, cannot be controlled. "I have nothing to hide" is not a statement of defeat. It is a way to keep living in a changed world without stopping for too long. And that is precisely what makes it dangerous. Because when people are no longer angry, they no longer resist. Not because they believe everything is right, but because they no longer have the energy to argue with an entire system. Surveillance does not require force. It does not require coercion. It does not require locked doors. It only needs time and quiet acceptance. The cameras remain. The data keeps flowing. Life continues. No one is forced to get used to it, but everyone slowly does. And when familiarity replaces anger, When convenience replaces principle, when silence replaces questions, surveillance no longer needs coercion. No new laws were needed. No additional documents were issued. No announcements demanded change. No one stood at a microphone to give orders. People adjusted their behavior on their own. The change began with very small things, so small that no one thought of them as change, not posting certain thoughts. Not because they were wrong, but because they felt unnecessary. Not searching certain keywords. Not out of fear of being banned, but because typing them into a search bar made people hesitate for just a moment longer. Not saying certain sentences, even at home. Not because anyone was listening. Not because there was clear proof. But because a vague sensation appeared before the words could fully form. Better not. That feeling didn't arrive as fear. It came as a gentle reminder, not harsh, not coercive. Just enough to make someone pause. People began choosing safer words, more general phrases. Thoughts that attracted less attention. No one asked them to do this. No one rewarded or punished them. And yet, they did it anyway. Because the world around them had taught a new lesson, that standing out was no longer an advantage, that silence was easier than argument, that not being noticed was a form of safety. Gradually, people weren't just controlling behavior. They were controlling thoughts before those thoughts ever became words. They began asking themselves what they should think, what they should keep, what they should let go. Not because they had grown weaker, but because they had become very good at adapting. They learned how to live in a space where no one ordered silence, but silence was always the least risky choice. And it is in that moment, the moment people begin correcting themselves without being reminded, that power reaches its most refined form. When people behave not because they are forced, not because they are threatened, but because they are aware they might be watched, something fundamental has already changed. There are no orders shouted through loudspeakers. No hands pushing people back into line. No visible chains. Life still looks normal, calm, orderly. People still speak, still move, still choose. But each choice now pauses for a fraction of a second, long enough for a question to appear, then disappear. Is this worth it? Is this necessary? Is this safe for me? No one taught them this reflex. It formed quietly through repetition, through habit, through the slow realization that attention carries consequences, so voices soften, opinions narrow. Curiosity learns where not to wander. Not because freedom is gone, but because using it feels heavier than it used to. And the most powerful systems no longer need to intervene. They don't have to correct behavior. They don't have to punish. People do the work themselves. They adjust, they filter, they comply without being asked. That is when control becomes invisible. And invisibility makes it perfect. So the question remains, not shouted, not debated, not resolved. Is that security? Or control perfected?